My name is Dan Klco. I'm the Associate Director of Consulting here at Six Dimensions. In the room, we have a whole number of our consultants as well as some folks on the line. And so we're just doing eating some lunch at our office, and we're going to talk through debugging in CQ and how you can do it, a couple different methods and that sort of thing. So 3 different things. This is a very, very, very short slide deck because I don't like dealing with slide decks. So we're going to talk about setting up custom logging, which if you haven't done that, it makes debugging a lot easier when you're not expecting problems. Starting up AEM in debug mode and debugging inside of your IDEs. If you guys have questions at any point, just feel free to interrupt and let me know and we'll talk through it. So first thing, I've got my CQ instance fired up. The first thing I want to do is talk about the custom logging. CQ's logging is implemented by abstracted by SLF4J, which is a logging framework. One of the neat things that they've set up is from the web console, you can add custom loggers. So I'm going to log into the Apache Felix web console. Come under here to OSGI configuration. And I'm just going to search for logging. So there's a number of different configurations here. It doesn't really show the details at all, which is kind of obnoxious, but what are you going to do? So I'm going to go ahead and add a new one. I can set any level I want. If you're not familiar with logging levels, it starts from the top and the most granular moves to the bottom. So trace is very, 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 very granular. Debug is granular. Info is usually like heartbeat messages, anything that tells what the application is doing. Warning is a problem that's not going to cause anything to be displayed to the user, or if it causes a system crash, error is, stuff has hit the fan. So I'm going to set it to trace, which means it should capture just about everything. I can configure a log file here, and they're all relative to CRX Quick Start by default, so you can change that path if you so desire, but really it's better to keep them underneath it. The pattern here is, it kind of is what it is. So I've got a couple of replacements in here. The only one that I sometimes take away is the current thread name. If you're doing threading work, obviously that's completely necessary. If you're not, it may just add more junk into your logs that you don't need. So sometimes I'll go in here and I'll actually change this to 4, which is the level, and then just remove the thread name. So once I go ahead and save it, it's going to refresh the screen. Every logger is going to be listed here, so you can, if you need to, you can click through them and figure out which one you actually set up. In this case, probably the last one. So inside that logger, once you've got all that set up, you can add any number of different logger names to attach to. So that's, whenever a log message is received, it takes the class that logger was instantiated with and goes ahead and logs messages against that. So it can be any portion of that and does like a substring type thing. So, COM, Six Dimensions, OSGI, CQ, or you can also actually, anytime you log inside of JSP, which generally speaking shouldn't be a thing, but it's, it happens. You can also put like apps.myapp. So you take the logger will actually send in the path to the component. So, it replaces the slashes with dots and apps dot, myapp.components dot whatever. So if you do any logging in your components, you can capture that too.
Can you talk through that one more time? I'm not sure how the logger.
Sure. So the logger is going to be telling this logging configuration what to actually capture. So you can, if you set it up with nothing, it'll capture everything.
Oh, that package.
Yep. Otherwise, it'll capture things coming out of that package or sub-packages. You can make this really granular. I've done this a lot, like set things to trace and done a particular class that comes out of, like the Adobe APIs. In that case, you want to be very granular because you get a lot. If you try to do like, com, day, CQ, your log will be like gigabytes in minutes. So.
If you leave it blank?
If you leave it blank, it captures everything.
Okay.
At that level. So if you look at the no bueno.
So what's the goal for logging?
The goal for logging, it depends. If you're talking about production logging, what you'd be doing is you'd probably be deploying a static configuration. In that case, you're capturing information about errors that occur mostly, and just the status of the application. For developer logging, you're talking more about capturing data on ongoing processes. So if you're testing something and something fails, first thing you check is your logs to see like, oh, well, did it throw an exception, or, you know, what did this happen? Before you resort to debugging, it's kind of a first level of, hey, something's wrong, I don't know what's happening, I need to diagnose it. A lot of times you'll see people, so we go into my CQ instance, there's an error log that comes automatically available with CQ. This one right here. The problem with using that as a debugging tool is the first thing, it captures everything, just like we talked about. So, but it captures it at info level, so you don't get any debug level logging. So it's not overly useful. If you see someone putting logs, a whole ton of log.info statements, I bet they're looking at the error log, and that's just silly because you're cluttering your logs up with stuff specific to a particular debugging a particular application.
So the team lead, what are you expecting your developers to do?
Yeah, so my expectations in terms of logging, I can actually show some code here. My expectation is that nearly, if not every method, would have a trace on the method that gets executed when the method first fires. That they would add debugging inside of their method, right? And the debug information should be A, in the form of a sentence, and B, provides state. So it tells you, it's comprehensible. It's not just like, hi, I'm here. If I see those, and I think I've seen those before with some of your guys and said something about it. If I see those messages, it tells me someone's, you know, trying to figure out what's going on and not really telling what's happening in the application. So it should be a form of sentence. It should have state. So you see here, this says redirecting to the URL from the current page. So I mean, you know, if you're looking through the logs, you'd understand exactly what just happened in that state. For errors, it should always have a message that tells why or, you know, what happened. And it can just be, hey, I encountered something weird and I don't know what's happening. Blah. It could be like if you're, let's say you're trying to access a file, you say, hey, I tried to do this, access this file, and it failed. And it should always log the exceptions separately. It shouldn't do like append the exception to the message, because then you don't have the stack trace for it. The only exception is when you have expected exceptions. If you're doing like thread stuff or something like that where an exception is expected to occur, then you probably don't log a full stack trace. But otherwise, yeah, always log a stack trace. And most of the time, not in this case because we actually want to be able to catch it here, but most of the time you catch and rethrow. There's a whole bunch of nuance there to handling errors. But, you know.
So the trace level logging line reading method makes sense to me, and the error level logging makes sense when you're catching an exception. What makes you choose debug there over something like info or
this could definitely be an info level message. The only concern there is how often it gets fired. So I set it to debug because it's something that could happen on a number of different pages. But there's no reason this could certainly be an info. I wouldn't put it as a trace. Trace is almost like granular to the point of being excessive if you turn it on in any real environment.
Yes.
Debug is, you know, you may turn it on briefly to see what's going on.
Right, that's what I was going to suggest is like debug is when you're actually debugging an issue.
Yeah.
And infos would be more like if you're just writing out a log for a certain process that you're going to write every single time around.
Yeah. And trace would be like, holy cow, I don't even know if my code is executing, much less, you know, I'm trying to understand what's happening. So that's usually the only place where I really use trace. It's either there or inside of loops. So I can use trace sometimes, you know, or to get accepted. The nice thing about this particular syntax here is that SLFRJ is smart about how it handles, how it logs this message. So it'll only do the replacements and the concatenation if debug is actually enabled, otherwise it'll move on. So especially if you have something that calls like toString on an object, and that toString call can be expensive. Anything, you know, dealing with JCR, network APIs or anything like that. Doing this where you put these curly brackets in here it'll replace the brackets with the following parameters, and that's a lot more efficient than than just concatenating them inline if the logging is disabled. Start. Any other questions about logging at all? So the next thing I'd like to talk about is actually debugging CQ. So I actually have a script here that's running CQ to start it. At the bottom of my screen. So every time I start CQ, by default, it actually will start inside of debug mode, which I consider really convenient. There's really not a ton of differences. When you double click on the jar, it just calls Java jar, and it actually forks the process and starts up on a new process with more memory and that sort of thing. So what we're doing here inside this script, and here's where it actually gets started, is it calls Java, sets debug, adds arguments there to give it more memory, and then this is kind of the core here. So it uses this debug port, which up here is set to 3033. It provides a JMX port, turns JMX authentication off, remote SSL off, and then just basically starts CQ. I started with the GUI on because it's nice to be able to click it and turn it off too. But so really starting CQ and debug is not hard. I wrote a blog post about a week ago with this script, so if anybody wants to go ahead and take a look at it. It requires you to set up CQ in kind of a particular manner where you have a dev folder with CQ underneath, and then the different CQ instances you may want to start. So I can actually start different versions of CQ and run them in parallel, and debug them separately without having to deal with collisions and that sort of thing. So if you have a few moments, I definitely take a look at it and see if it works for you.
If you're going to run two or more instances of CQ in parallel, like you said, I know you how do you specify you wouldn't want it all on the same port, correct?
Right.
I mean the debugging engine.
Yeah.
3033 on there. So, can you repeat the question? Would you be editing the script after you start?
Sure. So the question was, how would you run up or start up multiple CQ versions with them having sequential ports or different ports? Does that sound right?
Debugging ports.
Yeah. So this won't necessarily support starting completely different instances. So if it started, 5.5 and a 5.6 at the same time, you'd have to tell one of them not to debug. But what it does do is when you go ahead, you can go ahead and start an author and multiple publishes. And this is something I actually ended up using for a while because I need an author and two publishes. It'll start them, and when it starts the publishes, it just increments the debug port. So as long as that port range is available, it'll go ahead and start all those instances. One will be on 3033, one will be 3034.
Cool.
Yeah, because a lot of times I was dealing with issues around timing or across different servers, so I debug multiple servers at the same time, and it was entertaining. But yeah, I could certainly extend that to light it, because that would definitely be useful. Any other questions? Okay. So attaching a remote debugger is also fairly simple, if you can see it. Why are we going off the screen yet? Okay, well, it's fairly simple. So I can go into Eclipse under Run, Debug Configuration. And under the Remote Application, I go ahead and add a new debugger. And by default, it'll select my current project. So you want to, ideally, you want to always set up the remote Java debugger to be the same project you're using. Eclipse gets kind of dumb when you're dealing with source across multiple projects. You can add it in here too if you wanted, so I could add another project if I had one. And then all I really need to do is come here and change this port. So I've got the base page bindings provider. So the binding provider is a bit of code, Java code that's going to run before the page gets executed. So I just put a breakpoint in there, attach my debugger, and if I go to a page that I already set up, you can see that it's invoked the debugger. And at this point, I can step through the code and see all the variables that are assigned here. So I can see my properties come through. And I can step in or out as needed. So you can imagine how, especially if you do a nice application design where you have a separation for views and services where you could be able to, really easily step into your code, see what's happening before it gets sent back out to the user. And when I'm done, I'll go ahead and disconnect. The process for IntelliJ is really similar. So go ahead and select my bundle there. This is the same exact project, so just view it through IntelliJ. Go to Debug. I already set that up. Interesting. I have to cut through. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so go to debug configurations. I'll go to application. Sorry, remote. I'm a little bit less familiar with IntelliJ, as you probably can tell, so you have to bear with me a little bit. And I'll go ahead and attach that same port. Hope I actually stopped it. Yeah, having already stopped it in Eclipse. Otherwise, you'll get a connection refused. Okay. I did something wrong there. My apologies. Okay. And I actually create my debugger. Okay. So now I'm actually connected, so I can go in here, go into my source code, basically do the same thing. So add a breakpoint, refresh the page, and you can see I've taken to the debugger in here. So once again, you can go ahead and run through, step over, step into. And that's essentially how you debug CQ. So it's really not all that complicated. All you got to do is set up CQ or start up CQ. Again, using the parameters you can see in the script here. It's basically the same stuff as starting any Java application in debug mode. And then go ahead and attach your IDE of choice. Obviously, mine being Eclipse. Any questions at all on that?
Pretty straightforward.
Is that a question?
No. I say that's pretty good. Pretty straightforward stuff.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks guys for joining us, and hopefully we can do another one of these again soon.
I think I have a question.
Yeah.
So, with Maven build, can you debug them as well?
Yeah, so the question is, can you debug Maven builds? And the answer is yes-ish. It would be a completely different process from this. Now, I guess the question would be, what are you trying to debug? If you're doing integration tests, I've set up projects before where the integration tests will execute against CQ. So you put debugging statements in the code that the integration test will call, and as you call the integration test, you can step through the code that's getting executed. So if Maven kicks it off, runs the integration test, integration runs inside of CQ, which you're already debugging, and then you can see the integration test run if you're wondering why things have failed on an integration test.
Okay.
You can also, you know, if you're using JUnit or that sort of thing to do unit testing, you can debug those separately, but that's pretty much built into the IDEs already. Any other questions? All right, once again, thanks everyone, and hopefully we can do another one of these again soon.
I think a good follow-up might be to do one in